Hi, my name's Scott Fulbright. I beat the often path by turning algae into carbon negative ink products for shirts, packaging, and even leathers.
Welcome back to the Beat the Often Path podcast. I'm your host, Ross Palmer. On this show, I showcase unusual success stories to help us all think outside the box and, God forbid, develop a global perspective in our lives and careers. My guest today is Dr. Scott Fulbright, and he's the CEO and co-founder of Living Ink Technologies, a company that's developing the next generation of ink and coatings from algae. His innovative business model replaces the ubiquitous petroleum inks that are all around us, from greeting cards to packaging to clothing tags to shirts, you name it. Now, his inks and pigments are carbon negative, and by switching to their product, we can save pounds and pounds of petroleum while removing carbon dioxide from the air. It's a true win-win-win that's gotten him millions in funding, several honors, and partnership with big brands like Nike, Adidas, Patagonia, and more. Dr. Fulbright embodies the spirit of this show, so I can't wait for you to meet him and learn about Living Ink. Well, welcome to the show, Scott. So glad to have you here. How are you doing today?
I'm fantastic. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic as well. As we all know, every kid who graduates high school, the first thought in their mind is they're going to turn algae into more sustainable ink. It's a very common career progression. Thousands of people have done it. So what made you decide to hop on the bandwagon?
Oh yeah, easy. Just that one major that turns algae into ink and commercializes it in the business world. I went to school and I actually was going to be an engineer because both of my grandfathers were doing engineering type things, and so went to Michigan State. Signed up to be an engineer my freshman year, and then that summer I got a job teaching sailing in California, Catalina Island off of LA.
Oh, nice. Beautiful.
And a good gig. Didn't pay real well, but I had great waterfront property. I was a camp counselor, taught sailing, but I just fell in love with being on the ocean. You like sailing, there's dolphins, there's kelp, which is beautiful, Garibaldi. I just fell in love with marine biology. So I actually went back to Michigan State and said, I'm going to do marine biology, and I'm going to be a marine biologist, and I'm going to, probably be on a boat, tagging great white sharks or, doing dolphin work, and that's the marine biology kind of idea there. And when I went back to school, I said, I need to get a job. I need to get some experience. And, when you study marine biology in the middle of Michigan, you end up studying algae and not marine life in the ocean. And so I ended up studying algae blooms and how algae grows fast. And, sometimes it wreaks havoc on ecosystems. And as I was studying these algae blooms as a 20-year-old kid, I said, couldn't we use this material for something that's beneficial to society and use it for its ability to grow fast? And so that's what kind of got me started in the algae world.
Yeah, because usually when we hear about that, algae blooms, the context is that it's a pest or a nuisance or even a massive problem. What, broadly speaking, is the problem with algae in freshwater water sources, or where is it mostly a problem?
Yeah, so it can really, like every spring, Gulf of Mexico, huge algae blooms. So the Mississippi River dumps into the Gulf, and it's bringing all of that nutrient runoff from the Midwest agriculture. And those nutrients basically cause these massive algae blooms. And when the algae dies, it starts to create organic matter in the water, and then bacteria start to grow, and then basically it sucks the oxygen out of the water. And that's what leads to these fish kills and can harm other marine life. And so, algae is actually, it's the foundation of the ecosystem, right? Everything eats it. And so, when it's in balance with the ecosystem, algae is essential, right? 50% of the oxygen that we all breathe right now, no matter where you are in the world, no matter how inland you are, comes from algae. So, it's critical for all of us, just not too much in a specific location, like a bloom.
Yep. Right, exactly. And you're confronted with this, and one of the most fascinating lines of thought that we ever encounter on this show is when somebody turns garbage or waste into something positive. Was that something that's always been in your nature? How did you develop that mindset?
Yeah, I grew up pretty close with my grandparents who were, Depression era individuals. And, if you threw a rubber band away, they were like outraged, like the things that you could do with that rubber band, and, never throw away aluminum or glass. And so, I grew up with that kind of mindset of reusing things. Back in the mid 90s, I would spend like half of a Sunday with my father, like recycling things because you had to break everything up, wash it all out. The green glass couldn't be recycled with the clear glass, and then you'd have to go dump it. So yeah, I was kind of raised with those values of just, we have limited resources and we all know that. And, we have to be able to come up with these reusable systems. Otherwise, we're not going to end up in a good spot, which we're starting to see a little bit right now. So yeah, back in the 90s, my dad and grandparents were into the circular economy, whether they knew it or not.
Yeah. Well, I take issue with what you just said because I wish that we all knew that, but we all don't know that, unfortunately. Everything's fine seems to be the normal operating mindset around us these days. We're fine. It's just one big party. Let's keep on partying, right?
Yeah.
What's the harm?
Yeah.
But okay, so you grew up with conservation in mind, sustainability in mind, and you were confronted with this problem, Lake Michigan, and you realized, okay, maybe this could be turned into something positive. What was the next sequence of events from there?
Yeah. It's always, I found it to be at least a stressful time in life when you're graduating college and you've had, you have all these friends you've had your whole life, and now it's like, what are you going to do? And let me tell you, when you have a bachelor's in marine biology, there's an extra level of stress because there is not a clear path on what to do. I had friends who, got a degree in accounting. Like there was a very clear path of where they were going, and that was just the progression. So I didn't have that many contacts in my network, but I started reaching out to people saying, I'm looking for a job. I'm pretty open to all these different things. And one of the individuals that I had worked with as an undergrad in a laboratory, I was basically washing her dishes. She had gotten a job at a company turning algae into biofuels. And so that was one of my first moments of entrepreneurship. So, you can have an idea, you can go raise some funding, and you can try to make a product or a service and get it into the world. And a little backstory on me is that my dad was a professor at Michigan State. So I just grown up in the science world of you write a grant, you get some funding, you spend the funding to do really good research, you publish it to the world so everyone knows about it. And if it gets used, great. If not, it's a bank of knowledge that we've been creating for, millennia. And, but then this whole idea of impact and scale really was interesting to me of unless it actually scales at a material level, then the impact might not be felt. So I got a job at a company that would raise like $20 million turning algae into all sorts of different things, including fuel. That was the next big step where all these kind of aha moments kind of blast off in my head of what you could do.
That's so cool. And where do we stand on using algae as fuel? Is it a viable fuel source? What kind of fuel are we talking about here?
Yeah, so there was a couple companies that made everything from diesel to airplane fuel. So there's been planes that have been flown on algae fuels. There's been ships in our military that have run on algae biofuels. The big challenge is just scale and cost. Fuel is very cheap for the most part, even though we're used to right now it's expensive, but really when you think about it compared to other materials, it's pretty cheap. And then the scale that we use, it's just massive. So just trying to get agriculture, so algae farms that are large enough to fulfill our thirst of oil and fuel is difficult. So there's still some companies working on it. A lot of companies pivoted to get into more of the material space and less of the fuels. But I think there's a lot of people that believe in the next 10, 20 years that, algae fuel is a viable option in the fuel world. It's just going to take time.
Okay. And what percentage might we be talking about of total fuel use? A couple percent, 1%?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Yeah, even 1% is pretty large, right? When you start thinking about the gallons that's actually used. That's a good question. I think that I don't know the exact answer to that. I think it would be a relatively small percent, and it really location dependent, right? So my take on energy is that every geographical region is going to be using different sources of power. So I think the Southwest in the U.S., there's an option to grow a lot of algae and actually, have some fuel that's made down there. Up in like North Canada, it's a little harder to grow algae. But I'll tell you that there's a company up in Iceland, and they turn algae into all sorts of different products, but they're using geothermal energy to basically turn lights on. So it's carbon neutral energy to turn these lights on so they can grow algae. So they're growing really sustainable algae up in Iceland because of the geothermal energy. So it's just a combination of things. So to answer your question, I wish I knew the answer, but I don't. But I think it'll still be a relatively small part of the overall portfolio of fuels.
Well, I like what you said about the region-specific power. That does seem to make sense. And Iceland's got some crazy stuff going on. I'd love to visit. I've never been there, but I've seen the footage of their geothermal plants, and it looks wild. Just they got a lot of good stuff going on.
I would have never, it never crossed my mind to use that to then power lights to grow agricultural products, but it makes a lot of sense once you think about it, right? I mean, once that's set up, that's going to be growing algae or other crops for, decades, if not centuries, I would think.
Incredible. So harvesting this algae, does that reduce the other problems, or is this completely unrelated? Are you able to solve the problem of these toxic algae blooms at the same time as you harvest it, or is it just two different locations where this is happening?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Midterm, we think there's options there to go in and harvest that material. There are groups that are doing it. There's a shoe company called Bloom Foams. And so they go out, they collect these algae blooms, and then they put it into soles of shoes. And so they've launched with some of the bigger shoe brands out there. So there's some companies doing that. There's challenges to that model in terms of the blooms and kind of where they're happening and logistics. So right now we're actually working with domestic growers. So essentially algae farmers that have these massive 100-acre farms. They grow algae in these little tiny, in these kind of very shallow ponds using sunlight and water. And so right now we're using that kind of domesticated source of algae, but we're also using waste streams. So even these farms, they make their product of interest, and then when they're doing that, they actually generate waste streams, and we take those waste streams and we put it into our process. So we are still finding ways to use waste material in our process, even if it's not coming from the algae blooms.
Whoa, that's really cool.
Yeah.
Is water something that you need a lot of to do this, or using naturally occurring water sources? What kind of resources are needed to make use of it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So right now, water is needed. The algae ponds themselves are only about 8 to 10 inches deep. So it's not that deep in terms of the pond themselves. The farm that we work with, they're using renewable energy. They're recycling all the water. So, if you had my coffee cup full of algae, there's only a little bit of biomass in that algae, but you would spin it down, for example, and you'd get your paste of algae, and then all of that water that's remaining, you'd put back into the system so that you're constantly recycling it. So, a lot of these groups are getting pretty good at sustainably growing algae. But water is definitely needed to grow algae.
Yeah, that makes sense, obviously. And of course, with the sun, evaporation is going to be a big part of it for now, unless you're using the geothermal, like you said. Maybe they've got something else figured out in the land where there is no sun.
Yeah. The group up in Iceland and really around the world, there's some groups doing this that are actually doing it in closed systems. So think of like glass tubes. So you're actually reducing the evaporation because it's a closed system that's growing the algae, like aquaponics kind of. So there's a lot of different systems to grow algae, believe it or not. And there's a lot of pros and cons to those systems. One of the nice things about algae is that, what causes some of these algae blooms is that, when you fertilize a standard crop in the Midwest, and it rains, all of that nutrient runoff ends up in the Mississippi River, for example, and then washes down. In algae, you're kind of you're reusing the nutrients that aren't getting used, and you're recycling the water that didn't get used. So there's nothing that's like seeping into the ground and getting kind of washed away. So again, every crop has its pros and cons, but you're exactly right. Water's used, and there's evaporation if you're doing kind of these open pond systems.
That makes sense. So algae can be used for fuel. It can be used for shoes, for breakfast cereals, for inks. Is there anything algae can't do?
I mean, there's a pretty big portfolio of companies out there that are exploring every different avenue. I just talked to a company that's doing plastic bags made from seaweed. So like a fully compostable plastic bag that you could wrap a shirt in, or any kind of packaging. There's groups turning seaweed into all sorts of like liners, like on for fast food, rather than using a plastic liner, which makes the package or food container not recyclable. They're actually making it so it is recyclable or compostable. So yeah, amazing. I mean, you name it, and there's probably some startup company turning algae into it.
So algae, source of the future. That's so cool. Now, you could have picked anything. You were intimately familiar with the concept. You could have chosen any field. Ink. Why ink of all things? How did you even know that there was an issue there?
Yeah. I mean, I love this story because I feel like it's very common. But, I spent years in algae labs. I spent years at algae companies. I went to grad school and I was studying algae. And you sit there, in the laboratory at your desk, and you're just kind of thinking, like, think of an idea. Come up with an idea. There's got to be something out there, right? And then the next day you do it again. Like, I see all this stuff. There's got to be something. And so I was working in my laboratory one day, and I know it was my grandma's birthday was coming up, and she loves a good greeting card sent to her. And so I went out to this Safeway grocery store, and I was picking out a greeting card for her. And it really happened when I saw the cost of the greeting card. I said, well, what's a greeting card? Like, it's paper, it's an idea, and it's ink, And I was, why is it, $8 or whatever it was? And then I just realized, like, well, what's ink? And then I looked around the entire store, and like everything was covered in ink, like the floors, the packages, the signs. And it's one of those things that I don't think a lot of people think about. And I went home and I said, what is ink made out of? And it just came up that it was basically petroleum. Like, all of the colorants are made from petroleum or oil. All of the ink itself is typically made from petroleum or oil. And I said, the more I researched, the more I realized everything was petroleum. Like my toothpaste, it's like plastic bristles and a plastic handle, like all from petroleum. So, I was studying algae at the time, but I went down this path of just starting to look at the world and asking myself, what is everything made out of and where does it come from? And that was kind of a fun exercise, and I still do that today. So that's how we started to think about ink. And then I said, well, can we use algae as an alternative to petroleum-based colorants and inks? And if you ever fly into San Francisco airport, there's these massive back bays back there, and sometimes they're yellow and they're orange and they're red, and those are actually algae that are causing those colors. And so I'd seen that before. And so when I was in the grocery store, I kind of told myself, I know that algae make colors. Can you use those colors for ink? So I went back to my lab and I called my co-founder, because we were friends at the time and we were always trying to come up with ideas, of like, how do we turn this into a career, of what we're doing. And I pitched him this idea of a living ink. I said, we can use living algae. We can create a message that grows over time when you put it in front of light, which will power it to grow. So on day 1, it could say happy birthday. Day 2, a cake could show up. And day 3, it would say from Scott, happy birthday, Ross. And he was like, I don't understand. I don't get it. Like, it doesn't make any sense, which I like. When sometimes when you come with an idea and someone's like, I don't get it, be like, this is the brilliance of it. Like, it doesn't make sense, but I think there's something there. And so that was our first product. We did a Kickstarter campaign. And then we kind of went down this idea of like, hey, how do you make a product? How do you make an LLC, right? At first it's all daunting, and then you start doing it going, oh, it's not that hard. Or, now I know how to do that.
That makes perfect sense. Well, petroleum being the base of all of the inks that you think about, obviously that's not the only component of an ink. What else is ink made of? Petroleum would be the base, I assume, but the actual color or pigment would be something else generally, right?
Yeah, I mean, all of the colorants for the most part come from petroleum. So how does that work? They can take oil and they can basically do all these different chemical steps to get bright blues and reds, and even carbon black, which is the black pigment in my iPhone case and my headphones and black ink. That's just heavy petroleum that's basically burned at a pretty high temperature, and the remaining material is this carbon black that's used. So yeah, I mean, even the colorants that we see are typically petroleum derived, which is wild.
Even the blues and the reds. So what kind of step would it take to turn that blue or red?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of different kind of, synthesis steps within kind of organic chemistry, which I guess I used to do back when I was an undergrad and didn't know what I was doing at the time. Now I'm interested in it, but back then I'm like, let's do this step. Then, you add this additive and then you do this filtration step and then you end up with this yellow color and you're like, oh, that's one way that you can make a pigment. So, there's inorganic pigments out there. So, some pigments that are mined from the earth, like, if you go to Utah and there's like red earth, like, there's ways that you can kind of use that. But yeah, I would say the majority of the pigments, as far as I know, are mostly from petroleum today.
So then what were your first steps when you had this crazy idea? How did you begin to start going down that path?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I called my friend at the time who said, yeah, that's a bad idea. I don't get it. And then the next day he's like, I start to get it. I think I see that vision. Okay, let's, and so we had access at the time of, growing a little bit of algae and trying to like make our first kind of prototypes just to see if it would even work and go, okay, there's something there. It's definitely not good yet, but we can get there. And then we started we got like an LLC. So we, for $15 in the state of Colorado, submit like, hey,
super easy in Colorado.
Yeah, exactly. I think it was like, the company was called Grow Your Message LLC. And it was like, and so we submitted a provisional patent, which is, when you submit a provisional patent, I think it's $100, and you could submit a PowerPoint, a one-page document. It can be really anything to claim like, hey, this is an idea I have. I'll come back to you in 12 months with maybe more information if we're continuing to pursue it. So I remember we got the patent in and we felt really proud of ourselves. Like, oh, we just submitted a patent. I think it was pretty bad, but it was like, we got it in. And the other thing that was a game changer for us is we were at the time students, and we got into an accelerator within Colorado State University. And they basically, it was like a 10 or 12 week program of like, how do you start a company? Like, what's a patent? Like, what's a supplier? Like, just basic things of like running a business, which for us was like, just every evening, it was these like aha moments of like, whoa, I've never thought about that. I was typically the person that says, why is this pen $3 when the materials cost 3 cents? And then you go, oh, like there's that, and there's that, and there's that, and there's that. And then it's got to get here. And then I got to, someone's got to sell it. And you go, oh, okay, that's how it works. And that's often why, I think right now I'm very empathetic to the way the world is, because it's hard to get new things in the world because there's, historically there's just the way things have been done, and it's hard to change that because it's so streamlined and it's so efficient. And, so yeah, we got in that accelerator program and really learned what a business is and how to kind of get on our feet.
So at what point did you have the breakthrough where you realized we actually have a sellable product here?
Yeah, that's a good question. I remember we went down to this toy shop and, so we're doing something right now that's a little bit different than what we were doing at that time, but we went down to a toy shop in Fort Collins, Colorado, and we pitched this guy an idea, and he said, I really liked it. He was like he ran a toy shop, and you could tell he was a creative individual. And he said, I like that idea a lot. And I remember he gave us $1, and he said, remember this $1, this is your first $1 you've ever gotten. When you have the product, come back and I'll buy it from you. But here's your first $1, that's like my down payment or prepayment, And so I remember that going, like walking away going like, that's cool. He actually likes what we're doing, And of course it's like the toy shop owner in Fort Collins, Colorado. But we did a Kickstarter campaign, and we think we got about $62,000 as we did that campaign. And I think we sold like 1,300 units of that. And so that was when we were going, okay, people want this. They like the vision, and that was the moment, I think. One of the other stories that goes, to what your podcast is all about is the moment we went from this kind of niche, obscure idea, which is how a lot of things start, to more of a like, can we replace ink? Like, can we do mainstream ink and actually make a really big impact? And I was friends with a designer at the time, and he was like, you should take my screen printing kit and go to see if your stuff works. And I'm like, yeah, he doesn't understand what we're doing. Like, he doesn't get it. Like, it's not going to work. Like, we're doing our little product here. And so he's like, just take it. So one night at like 10 p.m., I'm in the lab, and I like take the algae, and I'm like just kind of messing with it. And I take the screen, which it's like a squeegee and a screen, which is basically holes that you jam ink through. And I pull the screen down, or the squeegee down in the screen, and I pull off the screen, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like it worked. like that's an ink, And it's like, that's like not a niche thing anymore. It's niche in its own way, but it's a real ink. Like, I could print brochures, I could do promotional materials, I could do birthday cards, like, and that, that was one of those moments going, oh, like, when you start combining a marine biologist who's studying algae with the designer who knows what screen printing is, like, there's some cool things that can come from those conversations.
And I only assume while you're doing that, lightning is coming down outside. It's raining. And you're screaming. And they're like, ah! It's a lie. It worked. And then 5 minutes later, the ink rubbed off, and you said, "Oh God,
it
back
faded
to square
away.
one." One wash, and it was gone. But for that brief moment,
Well, I did take a
god.
picture with my. I think it was like 2014 or 15, and I just got an iPhone. And I remember like taking a picture, sending it to my co-founder, being like, look at this, like this is real, like I just did this, and it's life's about expectations, and my expectations were so low, and I had no idea what I was doing. That I'm like, what's going to happen here, right? Nothing, or if anything, it's going to be a mess that I had to clean up. And then to actually pull that screen off going, wow, that was really detailed. It was really beautiful and it worked. I was like, wow, like the expectations were blown away. So I remember driving home and I was just like, hey, that's something, So, if you have enough of those kind of moments over a few years, like usually I think good things happen.
And the evolution obviously took you from one thing to another and then to Living Ink. So what are you thinking about now? What are your sights set on these days?
Yeah, so right now we're really in the middle of raising a pretty big round of funding to basically fuel expansion and scale of the product. So we just launched with Nike recently. We've got we did all of Patagonia's hang tags. We worked with launched product with American Eagle and Marmot, and we got some nice footwear projects coming out this year. So. Yeah, it's getting a little bit of funding to build the business the right way and continue to launch with brands in a very practical way of doing things. So that's a lot of brand conversations, a lot of factory conversations. So we send samples to factories of brands, and then we get feedback, or they ask a lot of questions. So yeah, it's growing the business is really where we're at right now.
Sounds brilliant. And obviously, those are major names, big names. I've only ever heard good things about Patagonia. They've come up a number of times on this show. Are they really that great of a company? Everybody says they're the best. The paragon of a great company is Patagonia. Is that true, do you think?
I mean, from what we've experienced, it is, in the way that I think the individuals that work there, the company culture, it's privately owned, so they can control the way that they do things. Rather than having investors or stakeholders that they need to report back to in terms of profits. So yeah, we've had a great experience with Patagonia overall, and I think everyone that I know that works with them, it only says good things too. So yeah, I can't change your mind on that one with my experience.
Nice. Obviously, you'd expect that, and obviously Marmot, you'd also expect. I guess Nike, you might expect less. They don't have necessarily the best track record on these things. Do you think that they're starting to shift, see the value of being more sustainable? Is this a conversation that more large corporations are willing to have?
Yeah, I mean, I'm like, I always say that for me as an individual, I'm like a skeptical dreamer, right? I have this dreaming side of me, and then there's this scientific skeptical, negative side of things won't change. But I got to say that in the last 2.5 years, really since COVID started, I've seen a lot of conversations turn into real actions, both individually and at some of these companies. So I think that there's been I think COVID and just that time that people had, that space to get perspective on the world, I think really changed. And we've been told in the past that a big brand will never pay more, they'll never work with a small company because there's risk and liability, there's just all these issues, and that's not what we're seeing right now. And I think that really did change in 2020.
Yep.
So
and another thing that changed is the name of my podcast is now going to be called Skeptical Dreamer. I'm stealing that from you.
You can have it. You can have it.
That's mine.
We're Colorado.
We're Colorado.
I'll give it to you.
It's got to exist, right? There's probably already a book. It's a bestseller. It's on the list, I'm sure. If it's first result on Amazon, obviously. And, what hasn't been done these days? But that is my default state. It's just the tension between cynicism and skepticism and idealism. And they're both so powerful. Yeah. So many terrible things happening, but yet there are so many really good, really smart people doing really good, really smart things too. Yeah. And that's basically the balance of why this show exists. Yeah. To showcase more people like you in a sea of all those other people. Yeah, no, I know. I appreciate the podcast and the
thesis there, because I do think you're right. I mean, there's a lot of great things going on, and I can say from the brand level, I mean, what I've started to realize is that, like I can sit there with my dad and I can recycle things, and that's needed, and everyone has a role in doing their part. But when you think about massive brands, massive factories, the amount of energy, the materials that they're using, I mean, that's where I think there starts to become impact. So I am encouraged with this whole kind of climate conversation, ESG conversation, where you've got consumers demanding it from a lot of these groups, and now you're starting to get some of the big investment firms that actually fund some of these companies to say you do need to change your carbon emissions, you do need to have actions. And so that's where I start to see some positive traction going on. I think there's a long road, and it's a very big scale that we work at in this world kind of global supply chain, but I see more action than I've ever seen than just conversation. So I'm encouraged, although faster is always better.
Yeah, for sure. And petroleum, of course, will always have its uses as long as it's available to us. But we have to ask ourselves, are we using it in the wisest way? Does it make sense to be using it for all these other things when we know we need it for fuel and things that we can't use anything else for? Does it make sense that my zucchini is packaged in petroleum? Do I need that? Do I need to have my deodorant come in a plastic? Why is it always plastic, petroleum-based? Does every card need to have ink from petroleum? Can we not take at least some of these things off of that plate? And you might notice this being interested in sustainability, but July, some people do plastic-free July. And I have been trying, but my God, it is so hard. There are certain things that you can do to reduce your plastic for sure, but getting rid of plastic or not even buying plastic for 1 month is damn near impossible in the way our society is set up. Certainly in America, at least.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, we can have the material conversation about, can we make bioplastics? Can we make biodegradable plastic? But I'm kind of like you in the rational thought of, like, do I need my tomatoes wrapped in plastic? Am I willing to eat fruit that has a little ding maybe that's not, packaged in a hard shell? And for me, the answer is yes, and I'm happy to do that. I think you're exactly right in the petroleum conversation. Like if you ever go camping, and I used to camp quite a bit and backpack, and you have like 3 liters of water. And that's so valuable to you. You would never you eat an apple if your hands were sticky. You're not like, let's just dump half a liter and wash my hands, because then that night you're like, oh my gosh, why did I wash my hands with the water, right? And so I feel like that's kind of what we're going to get to in petroleum. It's like, wow, what were we doing with that? Like that was so valuable. And there's some essential things, tires. Like we need tires in the world, whether it's an electric car or whatever, right? Like we need medical things that the petroleum can be used for. So I was at a conference one time, and someone asked me, like, do you think that, algae is the future of materials? And do you think that bioproducts are the future of materials? And I kind of thought about it, and it's like, the answer is 100% yes, because it has to be, like petroleum is finite. Like we know that there's only so much. And for us humans, we're going, there's plenty there. But when you think about 100 years, which is a very short part of how old this earth is, we will use that all up, guaranteed, relatively quickly. And then we're sitting there going, like, how do we make a toothbrush? How do we make ink? How do we make fuel? How do we make tires, right? So it's just interesting how short-sighted we can be as a community of humans. And it's difficult, right? We're all in the weeds. Everyone's busy. Everyone's got things going on. So I think these podcasts are really important to think about some of the basics there and ask these questions, like, do you need tomatoes or apples packaged in plastic when we know we need it for really important things?
Yeah, and the camping analogy is such a great one. And I also learned a lot about that thinking from space and the International Space Station, astronauts saying the amount of toothpaste that we use to brush our teeth by default is just stupidly high. When you only have 1 tube of toothpaste for months or years, they're like, you don't need that much toothpaste. Just a teeny tiny bit is plenty to actually do the job. And people are like, just use it. But in space, it's like we can only pack in so much. We only have so much weight that we can literally bring on a rocket.
Yeah.
Then you're going to think about those kinds of things, camping. But here we just waste is sort of our default state. And if you suggest otherwise, you're crazy or you're a nut or you're a maniac. Like, you're one of those. Yes, you have a PhD, but who cares, right? Who cares if you're a doctor? Yeah, you idiot. What do you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing, like we all know science. I mean, I like the rocket analogy, right? We also know science takes a long time, right? I mean, people always get frustrated, like, oh, we've heard about this one project. Why isn't it going bigger? It just takes time. Like it's just it just does. I've never seen a science project where like that was way faster than we ever thought it would be, and so I think that that's the other thing as we think about transition away from fossil fuels or petroleum. It's like it's starting now, right? And so you might see some obscure project, or even if you looked at us doing ink that was growing like 7 years ago, you're like, well, what is that? But like all these ideas have to be seeded now. They have to be worked on now in order for them to make any impact in the next decades, right? So people always look at fracking, right, and go, oh, like what a breakthrough fracking was. They didn't realize it was decades worth of R&D to get to the point where you could frack and get energy. They just kind of thought, oh, the breakthrough, it happened. So, we need to kind of have these breakthroughs in the biomaterial space, the biofuel space, and I think there's a lot of good things going on. I do think a lot of these brands can play a role in adopting these different technologies and, paying a little bit more to work with a startup in a novel material, but showcasing it is super critical that in terms of what I see in my perspective on these things. We get questions sometimes of like, even a couple years ago, are you cheaper than a company that's an $8 billion company that makes their product globally and has a super efficient supply chain? And the answer is no, because like we were a startup of like 2 or 3 people. We're making this with our own hands. So no, we're not. But this has to get adopted. And once it gets at scale, it will be, but it's hard for people to see that because it takes time and money and things like that. So yeah, I think that, again, I think all the stakeholders are understanding there's the problem and that we're working on solutions. So again, I'm more of a dreamer right now than a skeptic, but there's a little skeptic there.
Again, I think it's super cool what you've been doing. I know that it will continue to evolve and grow and in cool ways. It's a subject that I would have never thought of, but I'm glad to have learned a little bit more about it. We'll definitely monitor algae more in the future and maybe even buy a pair of shoes made from algae one day if I track down that other company.
Yeah.
But thank you, Scott. It's been an absolute pleasure. I want to give the final word to you, so promote whatever you like. So close this show out, whatever you want to say. Here we go.
Yeah, well, thanks, Ross. I love these unorthodox conversations about careers and ideas and how to start different things. So love what you're doing. For anyone interested in Living Ink, we are relatively active on all of the social media platforms and even LinkedIn. So happy to connect with anyone that's interested in you, whether you're an artist or you work at a brand or whatnot. So yeah, I mean, I think I'll end it the way we were kind of talking about. It's like, it's worth doing things differently. It's worth pursuing whatever you think your passion is. And if you try your best, then what else can you do? That's kind of my daily advice to myself.
Well, that is a fabulous way to end it. So thank you, Scott. And with that, the official podcast is over.